Regular listeners to Jones Day Talks Real Assets Roundup series know that, as you would expect, the topics and subject matters continue to broaden and expand. Today's program confirms that trend as the conversation turns to higher education and its real assets, funding, and infrastructure issues. Partner Brian Sedlak welcomes Christopher Good, Managing Director and Head of Higher Education Nonprofit Finance at RBC Capital Markets, and also Mike Mitchell, who works in research administration at The Ohio State University. They'll talk about the current stressors on the higher education model in the U.S. as we come to know it, and how P3s, or public-private partnership agreements, work in this space. Higher Ed, Real Assets, Jones Day. Class is in session. Stay here. I'm Dave Dalton. You're listening to Jones Day Talks.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Real Assets Roundup, where we talk about all things related to real estate, energy, and infrastructure. I'm the host, Brian Sedlak, a partner in Jones Day's Chicago office, and I co-lead the real estate, energy transition, and infrastructure practice. Today, our focus is on higher education and its relationship to real assets. With me are guests Christopher Good and Mike Mitchell. Welcome, gentlemen. This is the first time we've had third-party guests on the show, so you're the first. Welcome. I've probably worked with you guys for a combined period in excess of 30 years. But since I know you, why don't you introduce yourself? Chris, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Brian, thanks. We have the pleasure and the honor of being the non-Jones Day speakers, so tall order to live up to. Chris Good, Managing Director and Head of the Higher Education and Nonprofit Finance Group at RBC Capital Markets, so the investment banking arm of the Royal Bank of Canada. Work across a range and array of different types of transactions with a range and array of different types of institutions, but predominantly in the debt capital markets, in the infrastructure space, and then M&A.
And Mike?
Mike Mitchell, and happy to be here. It's good to see Chris, and Brian, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for asking me to participate. You will see joining me and my cat Bob wandering around behind me, but I am currently working in research administration at The Ohio State University. Previously, I'm a recovering lawyer and served as a lawyer at Ohio State a little over 10 years ago. And then the last 10 years, I've been in the Middle East as general counsel and advisor to the board of Qatar Foundation, working over that period of time on numerous P3s and alternative financing arrangements in the higher ed space. And right now, spending a lot of time focusing on addressing some of the funding challenges in higher ed research, particularly at Academic Medical Center at Ohio State.
So, Mike, when I first met you, maybe in 2010 or around there, you were in Columbus. Then we worked together while you were in Doha. Now you're back in Columbus. It's wintertime, 4 Fahrenheit, maybe at least in Chicago on Thursday. Midwest still treating you well?
I enjoy looking at the snow. I'm always cold. 10 years in the desert will do that to you. Also, I guess getting old does that. But I love the seasons, but I got used to the warmth. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, you mentioned funding and how you've been working a little bit on the funding aspect and how you did that as well with the Qatar Foundation. And higher ed today is real asset rich. Obviously, it has a lot of tangible, large-scale assets. It's somewhat liquidity constrained, some would say. Endowments aren't magic pixie dust that could be sprinkled anywhere you want. They're somewhat constrained. And perhaps some would say the higher ed model is a little bit structurally stressed these days. Chris, why don't we start with you? What's your view on the current state of higher ed, particularly as it relates to real assets?
Yeah, it's tough to say that anybody in higher education, irrespective of what size institution you are running or operating, is having a particularly easy go of it at the moment. Whether you're reading headlines in the Journal or on Bloomberg, conversations around stress and distress in the higher education sector have been pervasive throughout the course of 25, really started to accelerate in 23, 24, coming out of the pandemic. And it's been interesting to see how the business model has come under pressure and how institutions have been working to creatively respond to confront what's now a whole new range of risks. Maybe I'd just differentiate, right? So it's always challenging to talk about higher education in the United States because the sector is so broad, right? It's like approximately 3,000 higher education institutions in the US. They break down roughly a third across nonprofit private universities, public universities, and then for-profit institutions. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to focus my comments on, call it the top 200 private and public universities in the United States. So think of large enterprises, you would see them on a Saturday if you were watching football. You would maybe going to their academic medical center for some form of medical treatment. That business model has been resilient, but not without challenges and pressure. It comes from a few different areas. One, just structurally, continued ongoing pressure with respect to net tuition revenue, not the sticker price, but the discounted price that students are offered from institutions. That net tuition revenue number has seen continued pressure on a year-over-year basis, and institutions have really had to confront what their enrollment profile looks like, especially institutions in the Midwest and the northeastern part of the United States where there's population decline, to be able to attract the same number of net revenue tuition paying customers. And across the board, net tuition revenue is one of the biggest revenue drivers for the business enterprise. That's run into challenges and headwinds and is expected to continue to do so, right? At the same time, if you think about an institution like, and Mike, you could speak to Ohio State University, but roughly 65% of the top line revenue to Ohio State comes not from the academic enterprise, but from the medical center enterprise, right? So the challenges that academic medical centers are facing specifically in light of OB3, challenges with Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement rates, figuring out what an appropriate payer mix is, that revenue stream has also come under pressure, right? And as you start to work your way through the other businesses that academic institutions are in, right? So take athletics. In the light of the House settlement, the advent of NIL, pressure on that margin stream is also being further compressed by virtue of the fact that there's a large subsidy that now needs to be paid to university employees who are college athletes, right? You start to run down the list, and by the time you make it to federal research funding, which has been cut by the Trump administration, and pressure with respect to international enrollment, given the political climate that we're facing, and then real pressure in terms of students gaining access to the United States, it is a tough business to make margin in across the board, right? And to the point, Brian, about liquidity, with any type of business volatility comes a concern and a focus around liquidity and sources of liquidity. That's been at the top of management teams' minds for most of 2025, certainly in the first couple quarters of 2025.
And Mike, you don't have to respond directly with respect to any particular institution, but would you agree with that, with Chris's views on the state of higher ed? Is there anything else we should be focused on here?
Yeah, and that was a real comprehensive kind of summary of that, which I appreciate, Chris. Just one other thing that is relevant and really goes to the long-term sustainability of the business model is the overall view, the favorability rating of the higher education degree, and the value of that degree or perceived value of that is really a concern at this point. I mean, you look at some of the studies and some of the surveys done on just the favorability rankings of higher education itself and the value of the degree, that has to be addressed in order to have the long-term sustainability. So that's the only thing I would add.
How do you think higher ed institutions are addressing some of these issues, keeping in mind there's a vast difference between flagship universities, land-grant universities, and maybe what I'll call a 1,500 student liberal arts college in a very lovely rural place, bucolic. What do you think? How has higher ed been approaching these kind of structural challenges?
Yeah, you're right. The rich get richer and the poor get the picture, as they say. So tier one research university, multiple revenue streams, asset rich, has a lot more levers it can pull in order to address what's going on. It has the ability to influence the policymaking environment through its activities. I'm not going to say lobbying, but through its activities. It has the ability to tweak the business model in a way that the bucolic liberal arts college located next to a farmer's field does not. And therefore, the long-term prospects and sustainability of the tier one flagship is more assured. Enrollment, all of the other numbers would bear that out. Chris, I'm interested in hear your perspective on that, what you're seeing.
No, I think you're spot on, right? The focal point where the rubber meets the road is the conversation around mission versus margin from an institutional perspective. And what's been challenging for even very sophisticated and competent management teams has been the nature of the headwinds that the sector is facing as a whole, figuring out what components of the enterprise and what components of the mission you're able to advance in what is like overall a time of scarcity for higher education. That's scarcity with respect to federal research funding. It's scarcity with respect to consumer appetite for the product. It's scarcity based off of market volatility in the endowment portfolio and investment income and investment earnings, right? So there's I'll be a higher ed nerd for a moment here, a great higher ed theory called Bowen's revenue theory of cost, which is to paraphrase it, if you asked a higher education president of a university or a college, how much money does it take to run this place? The answer would basically be, well, however much I can get. Right. And it's true, right? The point of that is like, well, there's always something new that you could be doing in the pursuit of knowledge, right? You could always fund another research project. A faculty member could always take another sabbatical. There's another student that you could enroll, right? And that the tension that the sector is facing to some degree is there is just less margin to go around. And that implicitly is forcing conversations and discussions around the mission and the relative portfolio of businesses or activities that a university is in. It's an environment of challenging choices, especially building out like a long-term cogent view of what the space is supposed to look like in 10 or 15 years, which my own view would be not too different from what we're looking at today, right? In terms of like Ohio State isn't going to go anywhere, but the nature of the portfolio of activities and the way that the institution is functioning, that may look different in the future, especially in some of these areas that intersect with real assets like dorms. If you're seeing more transitory student populations come to school, look to downsize on the cost if you necessarily want to live in a dorm, or something like the college athletic model, right, which is coming under pressure from some smaller schools. That's where the conversation around efficiencies with real assets starts to get really interesting, is how do you leverage some of the private sector expertise, really rapidly changing market environment to run those types of assets more effectively in a margin constrained operation.
Although I guess that at least all of the research I've seen seems to reflect that the longer a student is in a on-campus residence, the better they tend to do. And I was young once, believe it or not, and I know there was always a desire to be kind of further, like when I was in the Army, the desire was to be off base. When I was in college, the desire was to be off campus. But there does seem to be a continued investment in student housing space on campus, and either directly by the universities or maybe, to your point, Chris, in terms of the private sector partnering with kind of well-known private parties to develop those student residences to basically provide the amenity, but to not have to outlay the capital.
It's been a real provocative area of growth for schools. And I'll frame this in sort of 2 or 3 different contexts. So one is thinking about just the relative efficiency of being able to construct housing using your own internal capabilities versus the external capabilities of a partner. And by the way, the relative efficiencies with respect to speed and timing to market of having someone who is functioning maybe for a public institution, not as a publicly regulated entity, not as a state, effectively a branch of state government with respect to hiring, contracting, speed of execution, time to market. There can be some real efficiencies in terms of picking up a partnership with someone who can just go faster to build what's necessary. I also think it's true. We're seeing more universities, especially ones that are in the Sun Belt region, think aggressively about acquisition of existing housing stock that is campus edge. It really has nothing to do with anything that the school built previously. So if you're focused on revenue recapture and there is a dorm that a developer has built that is campus adjacent, and you are trying to come up with a way to own the margin of the students by putting them in housing that you own, you're thinking about whether or not it makes sense to acquire that existing housing stock versus go through the real estate acquisition process, the construction process on a standalone basis. In the pursuit of margin, you're seeing a lot of institutions look aggressively at, does it make sense to build more? Does it make sense to own more? And what's the most economically efficient way to go about leveraging that type of partnership and that type of collaboration?
That's a good point. And staying on kind of the real assets kind of note here, Mike, it would seem like the provision of education would be something that would be ripe to put up on the internet, so to speak, to have people learn remotely. But the view is probably, from this non-educator standpoint, that the college experience is more about learning, so to speak, or at least learning online. It's more about the kind of the physical presence and learning from those about you. But at the same time, there has been a trend of like going to the students in terms of opening satellite campus facilities so it's easier for the students to attend, and maybe using AI and technology to give them a more kind of bespoke campus experience through that. Do you think that's right, or you think that's not really what's going on?
No, I think it's right. I think if you continue to view it as it has been the model, which is your first year class is 17 or 18-year-olds, and there's 4 years of education. The idea that you're immersing someone into an environment, so on-site is better than remote. A lot of evidence, a lot of studies done about what the pandemic and what the current social media and technology is doing to young adults and isolating them. It's even more important now to put people in an environment where they have to interact with people, where they have to discover different ideas and viewpoints, etc. But if you look at it from education as something which is a little broader and not as hidebound as it used to be, you're looking at non-traditional students, you're looking at older students, you're looking at people re-entering education, maybe coming to get certifications as opposed to four-year degrees. As that all evolves, you're having a mix of people who may not want to live in a dorm room environment, right? And so the commitment of long-term capital to building what is a traditional shared space, whether it's a more modern type of quad or other things, may not be as relevant as it used to be. That the mix is important. You can address that through the acquisition of these non-traditional assets that are adjacent to campus or otherwise around that provide that to these different types of students. And that makes a lot of sense. That these long-term commitments, the borrowing and the building and the counting on that long-term revenue stream from housing and dining, I just don't, that model is ripe for change. The expectation that people will be there for 4 years is changing to a certain extent. That if you listen to some of the commentators talking about how higher ed has to change, people like Scott Galloway, who I find has a kind of fascinating view on this, that what institutions of higher ed should be doing is opening their doors to more and more and more people, as opposed to this velvet rope that creates this highly valued credential, and talking about tax exempt status being at risk if they're not opening it to more people. Preeminent institutions of education, higher education, are bragging about the fact that their admittance rates are the lowest they've ever been, and the ratios are low, when in fact they should be offering that to more and more people as a public good. So the broader you open it up and the more you open it up, you're going to have different models, because limited enrollment means limited number of accommodations required, limited amount of food to be sold and fed. So there's a lot of change coming, that how these assets are financed or even contemplated and planned are going to have to change as well. And again, I've been wrong about other things, and I could be wrong about this, but I just think the ability to be flexible has to be built in.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm a beneficiary of the GI Bill, and I went to commuter college, and I was very thankful for that. It really provided a transformative experience for me, but kind of the hypocrisy of it all, or maybe it's the American dream, or maybe it's both. Like for my kids, I wanted the most kind of prestige and elite university experience for them. And maybe it's a little bit of just kind of living through your kids. I'm not quite sure, but I just turned 59. And so I have 6 years left practicing law. So I've kind of thought about maybe going back and getting a psychology degree when I'm done and being like the tough love psychologist. So if there's any university admissions officer or president out there who wants to develop some type of program for a lawyer on the back end of his career, still very vibrant, I'll give you.
Curious. You've always been curious as well.
Yeah. So. They should reach out to me.
Thank you, Brian. You should have mentioned that point as well. But it's interesting, Mike. One thing that kind of resonated for me with what you were saying. So the focus on cost and affordability as a barrier to access is a real challenge. That's part of what everyone would point to in terms of the reticence and the questioning about the overall value of higher education. It's like we were talking to the CFO last week, and the comment was made, sending 3 kids to college 2 decades ago, that was like buying 3 cars. Now it's like buying 3 houses. And there's a limit to what the market is going to bear with respect to tuition revenue. There's a limit with respect to what the consumer is going to take on in terms of student debt. And by the way, that's not even taking into account what OB3 did with respect to the elimination of Parent Plus and Grad Plus loans, which is going to make it more difficult for student attendance. It's going to increase the cost net of being able to attend some of the programs that are most margin producing for institutions, the graduate program. And so the part that you see people struggling with is a little bit of, okay, well, I need to come up with a way to deliver the same quality product at a lower price point. There's been a buildup in terms of the assets and the infrastructure that I know, that I own, sailing into revenue headwinds with deferred maintenance and upkeep on all of these facilities that I am running at a point in time where the consumer always going to need to be physically present for education to be done well, but maybe you don't need to be physically present all the time for every aspect of the degree. And as more pathways open up that require less physical time on campus, like what does that mean for the size of the campus? What does that mean for the size of the infrastructure? And how do you think about managing that pool of assets? That is a macro question that people are starting to struggle with and try to build an outlook around. It's an area that's ripe for innovation.
And speaking of innovation, the listeners will criticize us for not addressing P3 if we don't do that, since we've been involved in some of the first P3 transactions in higher ed in the United States, as well as some of the first of a kind transactions that have taken place. When we first started doing this in, 2008, 2009, something like that, the model was really more of a monetization model. And the interesting thing about all P3 to me is that the people that really need the money the least are the ones that are more capable of generating funds from the model. Like if you don't have good credit, if you've got financial issues, P3 is probably not a good model for you. But it seems like there's been a shift from the P3 model of monetization to the DBFOM model, which is not obtaining a large pool of money up front that can be spent on various projects, be put in an endowment. But the shift seems to be more of a DBFOM, design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, where deferred maintenance needs to take place, or a new central utility plant needs to be built, or a new hospital needs to be built. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the considerations in structuring a successful university P3 transaction. Mike, why don't we start with you, since you've been there since the beginning of that in the higher ed industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. And my view of it is shaped by my participation in these deals with you, Brian. So you and I have a particular outlook. Obviously, you've done way more than I have. I've done it on behalf of the owner, and you've represented folks in various positions in this. But you look at the priority from my perspective, the priority was not the pool of money. The priority was cap cost avoidance, dealing with deferred maintenance issues, having funds available to spend on other things that are priorities, right? So what did Gordon Gee say? Parking space never cured cancer, right? That resonates still. And so you have to go in with your eyes open about knowing what it is that you want to obtain out of the P3 deal. That it's nice if you can do the pool of capital, but only if you're going to use it to put into a long-term endowment to earn money out of it in an arbitrage play, right? I mean, that's the reason to have that, because if you use that money right away, everybody's going to forget about why you did it after that money is gone. And people generally do not view these transactions favorably in a university community. That's an overstatement, but there's still some suspicion of it. But that the circumstances now where you're not going to have these big pools doesn't lessen the imperative of doing these things. It's even more important now to address some of those things like deferred maintenance, cap cost avoidance, improving facilities, responding to the needs of the institution. So that's just my view at this point.
Chris, any view on
that? I guess maybe the way that I would frame it financially is, like 10 years ago, this was a balance sheet trade. Now it's an income statement trade. And the way that I would frame that is, more specifically, is like, look, if you, in a low interest rate environment, if you were able to arbitrage the market to get a large pool of capital that you were then able to put alongside of your endowment and net make out in a way that was margin accretive by virtue of higher investment income from a P3 transaction, that construction structure made a tremendous amount of sense. And maybe it still will. You can see a world where in a declining rate environment and in a liquidity constrained environment that institutions are sailing into now, maybe the concession balance sheet improvement structure comes back as something that people are more interested in interrogating. The focus now, it's all about how can we improve the income statement? How can we reduce operating expense? How can we bring in someone who's qualified to help take expense out of the equation? Because we're looking under the couch cushions for margin improvement any place that we can find it. And Brian, I know we've talked a lot about the repackaged energy P3, energy as a service type construct, which really isn't about an upfront concession payment at all, as much as it is guaranteed performance with improvement with respect to the operation of a university's utility plant. That's something that any institution should be looking at now, especially as they're trying to come up with a way to maintain healthy margins to subsidize other parts of the business. So that's sort of my sense of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you are seeing it becoming more popular in the higher ed and the healthcare space. That's the other place where it works. Also in that context, it's also a risk shifting exercise, right? To have a world-class builder come in, build a plant, since they're the ones that build it, and they're responsible for operating and maintain it for let's call it the next 30 years. You're somewhat assured, because it's a closed loop system, that they're going to build it to a proper standard. They're neither going to gold plate it nor are they going to underbuild it, because they need to be responsible for the O&M during that 30-year period. So I've seen that as kind of a growing way to meet some of the demands that have been placed on universities with respect to energy. There's still some universities who are trying to engage in the energy transition and lower their carbon footprint. And there are others that their energy system has just run out of time. It's time to build a new one. And they have a lot of demands on their capital, as we've talked about. And this is one way where it's another financing mechanism that, in essence, they don't have to use their own capital to get that project done. So I do think that that's going to be a much more popular way moving forward. So with that, I know we've probably gone a little longer than we intended. Mike, any key takeaways that, particularly being from the university side, any key takeaways that university leaders should be thinking about in terms of where we're at in higher ed or the P3 process? What would be the battle scars in terms of the lessons learned from Mike Mitchell?
Yeah, I think it's making sure that there's full alignment, right? That everybody that's involved has a complete understanding of what will and will not happen in such a transaction, regardless of whether it's energy, parking, dorm facilities, lab facilities is a big one, the one that we looked at in London a little bit. Brian, one of the things you and I looked at on one of our projects, the need for wet labs and other research spaces. There's a lot of opportunities, but everybody needs to be fully aligned, and the expectations have to be clear so that feelings are not hurt. We've all seen circumstances where that didn't happen. Another thing that's happening right now, and what I view as a positive byproduct of this current administration's view regarding F&A and research funding, is causing facilities administration or indirect costs associated with large-scale grants, whether it's NIH or NSF, is this requirement under the proposed FAIR Act of making the universities document clearly what their facilities and administration overhead costs are associated with grants. Because you started seeing at the preeminent institutions an F&A rate, which was 65, 70% of the overall grant. So you get your grant dollars, and in addition, you would get 70% of that in addition as facilities and administration overhead for the grant. Obviously that they've cut that significantly or intend to cut that significantly, but they're also requiring universities to look into and document clearly what their administrative expense load is and what their true facilities costs are. And I don't think that most institutions, and Chris, I'd be interested in your perspective, have really done a huge deep dive and have firm control as a corporation would of their actual expenses. And so this is a good thing. And it can do nothing but help universities in the long run of truly understanding the cost of research, truly understand the cost of buildings and their overhead expenses from an administrative standpoint. That will inure to all of our benefits as taxpayers and consumers, but also people who work and support the higher education industry. I think it's important that those things happen. So that's just my current perspective on that.
Mike, it's such an insightful comment, because it's like the Bloomberg phrase, if you can't measure, you can't manage. And going back to that Bowen revenue theory of cost analysis, if you were talking about the way that institutions did budgeting again 20, 30 years ago, you're in an environment of abundance. The impetus was to just say, look, we're going to raise tuition 5% next year. Year over year expenses can go up. We're not necessarily concerned about the operating model, the viability of the operating model. And in an environment of scarcity, which is what it looks like we're in and what we're going to be in for the foreseeable future, you just have to get more focused around the measurement of the businesses that you're in. If that measurement happens, right, in an idealistic setting, you get more efficient about figuring out how to deliver the mission. It also opens up the question as to, for the businesses where you're not particularly effective, can you find someone who's more effective to help you out with it? And the more facile the sector becomes in terms of having that dialogue around where do we have the competency, where are we really good, and where can we bring in some outside expertise. Again, that's where I think there's a really interesting problem set for public sector and private sector to collaborate with each other. I'd say, Mike, with respect to your background, I'd give a big OH.
You're not going to get it from me. I work there. I didn't go to school there, Chris.
Oh, come on!
I can't do it. No, I can't do it. I'll probably get fired, but I can't do it.
Listen.
I'll not try to upset any of the Michigan fans, but in that last game, I did think that the whole Brutus thing with the Ohio script in the snow. That I kind of appreciated.
It was entertaining. It
Yeah,
was
that was pretty good. So I'll give that. Thank you, everyone, and please join us on our next Real Assets Roundup podcast. Have a great day.
Thanks very much, Brian. For contact information for Brian Sedlak, please visit jonesday.com. And while you're there, visit our Insights page for additional podcasts, videos, publications, newsletters, and other timely content. And of course, you'll find the previous Real Assets Roundup programs on that page. Subscribe to Jones Day Talks wherever you find your podcast programming. Jones Day Talks is produced by Tom Condolis. As always, we thank you for your time and for listening. I'm Dave Dalton. We will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Jones Day Talks. Comments heard on Jones Day Talks should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. The opinions expressed on Jones Day Talks are those of lawyers appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information, please visit jonesday.com.